Good afternoon, everybody. Also, good morning. I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar on the opportunities and challenges of exporting to Australia. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I am the Digital Content Manager at Open to Export. We are an online community helping small UK businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our export action plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find out about all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's only professional membership body for traders, offering a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the session. You can ask questions at any point during this webinar using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We have two great speakers today, with Ned Shelton from Sheltons Accountants introducing some of the tax and legal requirements of selling goods and services in Australia. Sheltons Accountants are an independent accounting firm working exclusively with SMEs based outside Australia, working within the Australian market. Ned is the founder and managing director, and he has years of experience helping companies from Europe to sell into Australia. And kicking things off, we will have Richard Harper from Keyway Trade Initiatives, who will be giving a market overview and some tips around the opportunities out there for British businesses, and some guidance around business culture there too. Richard has previously supported companies exporting to Australia while working at UKTI and continues with his own consultancy business. So over to you, Richard.
Great, thank you very much indeed, William, and it's great to be talking to you. I'll just introduce myself briefly. I don't need to do much of an introduction now because I've had a great introduction, but as I said, I had a previous job working over here with UKTI, or DIT as it now calls itself, in Australia, and also back in the UK with the same organisation where I was an international trade advisor, helping UK companies look at export propositions from the southwest of England, which is where I was based in Cirencester, to all over the world. I was doing that. Previously, I worked in the oil industry for Texaco, Caltex as it's called here in Australia, and I have actually also helped my wife run a small import business before I got involved in doing the same thing myself. And helping a wife run an export business is nothing like running it yourself, let me tell you. Anyway, the next slide, please, William. And just a little bit of a look here of what we're talking about, the population of Australia. And for those of you who probably might not have an idea of how big Australia is, got just around about 25 million people living in Australia. As you can see there, 4 large cities, all of which, with one exception, are down the eastern seaboard of Australia: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, all up the eastern seaboard, Sydney in the middle, Melbourne around about, I'll do it in pounds, shillings and pence, around about 500 miles to the south, and Brisbane around about the same sort of distance, 500 miles to the north of Sydney. And Perth, 3,000 kilometres, I'll switch to kilometres, over the other side of the continent, and in between Sydney and Perth, not very much at all. Sort of very, very little that a lot of people say, well, yes, that Australia can be likened to a desert island with lots of people living on the beach. But the distance between Sydney and Perth is around about the same distance as between London and Moscow, just to sort of fix that in your head. And that is important when I get to talk about some of the other things, which I'll do on the next slide, please. And how big is Australia? Well, I think most people realise it is enormous, but I think that diagram gives you an idea of just how enormous it is, where you can comfortably put the whole of Europe inside Australia and leave room for a lot of other islands, principalities, countries whatsoever. And as you can see, the UK up there in the top right left-hand corner could actually sort of fit very easily into the whole of Australia, and probably nobody'd notice it for a week or two if you did transpose it and put it there. So it is a big country, and that is important in terms of doing business in Australia, that you might often hear the term tyranny of distance. And in Australia, it's really important to understand that moving goods around, to move goods from Sydney up to Brisbane, down to Melbourne, across to Perth, is quite a challenge. And particularly with the communications infrastructure, it's getting better, but it's still not perfect. Next slide, please. And what I've done here is try to give you another perspective of Australia, separating here the population densities of greater than 100 people per square kilometre, which gives you really the idea that Australia might be more akin to an archipelago of islands than a huge homogeneous country. All right, down the eastern seaboard, as you can see the population centres reasonably dense all the way down the eastern seaboard, swinging around the corner down at the bottom right-hand corner, that's Melbourne, and up into Adelaide. Over there on the left-hand side of the island, you will see just a population centre there, which is Perth and the environs. Up at the top, you've got Darwin, and then in the middle, not very much at all. The middle dot there is Alice Springs. Over to the left is Mount Isa, and to the right, Kalgoorlie. Next slide, please. And the top 7 cities, which is really where your market is. If you're looking at marketing to Australia, this is really where you need to be, where you need to look to see whether your agent and distributor is located. And probably if they're not located in one of those 4 major cities, then you'll have to ask yourself, well, what are they doing? How are they servicing the market? When you consider that in a lot of cases that a distributor might be based in one of those 3 states that I talked, or one of those 4 states I talked about, how are they going to service the rest of the market? What sort of sales offices do they have in Sydney if they're based in Melbourne? How do they service Brisbane? How on earth do they service Perth? What sort of warehousing do they have? What sort of sales team do they have? All important questions you need to ask when you're dealing with a potential partner, and also looking at what sort of market you have and where the market's likely to be. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk very much about this because I'm not going to steal Ned's thunder here, but you will no doubt hear a lot about GST, goods and services tax, which, as it says here, very similar in concept to UK VAT, apart from the fact it's held at a rate of 10%. And yes, I'm sorry, you do have to pay it. The fact you're British and you're not an Australian citizen, as one UK company complained loudly to me, doesn't make any difference whatsoever with the Australian taxman. There is a little bit of confusion because until recently, internet sales of under $1,000 were rated or were exempt for GST, but that's now history. Most food does not have GST on it, and also protective Australian customs tariffs, as it says here, are generally quite low, with a couple of exceptions, which are luxury motor vehicles, some agricultural equipment, clothing, textiles, footwear, that sort of thing, but generally quite low now. But I'm not going to go any further about that because I'm sure Ned has a lot to say about all of that. So the next slide, thank you. Now, what I'm going to talk about here, and I'm sure that this is really teaching a lot of you how to suck eggs, but how do you get into the Australian market? Well, probably the most popular way, and the one that most UK companies use, is a combined agent and distributor network. And when we say agent over here in Australia, probably what we're talking about, rather than a commission agent, is somebody who will actually deal with you and will take responsibility for your goods over here and will be responsible for buying them and then finding a market for them. So he will take the role of both somebody who will import, who will buy your products for you, and probably that when they do that, they will demand some sort of exclusivity, either statewide or nationwide, which gets back to some of those questions I think you should ask when you're talking to a distributor, and also distribute it. So they will know the market, they will know the market for the particular products, they will know the route into the market. Then, of course, underneath that, there's manufacturer under license. So a license agreement, which might be to, if you can't for whatever reason bring your products into Australia, perhaps look at some sort of licensing agreement where you might be able to bring maybe the clever bit of what you're making over here, get it manufactured under license, which indeed a lot of UK companies do. A fulfillment house, and people say, well, what is a fulfillment house, and what is the difference between a fulfillment house and an agent or a distributor? And quite simply, a fulfillment house is a warehouse which will exist. They will carry your goods and warehouse your goods, and they will dispatch them to customers. But what they don't do is that important function of a distributor, which is go out there into the market to seek new customers, to have a sales force who sells. So they will distribute, and they will hold stock in inventory, but they don't have the function of going out there and actually finding a market. E-commerce becoming very much more popular, and I know that there are probably going to be a couple of questions about Amazon and what Amazon's going to do over here in Australia. But e-commerce is something that Australians have taken to very readily indeed, that I've heard that with the exception of, I think, two other countries, one of which is the United States and another is a country in Europe, I think that e-commerce is probably taken by Australia as more or less, well, it is very much, it's more popular here in Australia than more or less any other country in the world. Australians have taken to e-commerce very readily indeed. A subsidiary, and that's probably not something you want to consider immediately, but if your product is doing well over here, and if you are selling a lot of product in Australia, then it might be the time to look at some sort of subsidiary company that perhaps you can either buy an existing company or set up your own company here in Australia. And again, I'm not going to talk too much about that because that's very much Ned's turf. Then talking about franchising, well, yeah, sort of business in a box, it's called. And again, if you do run a franchise business over in the UK, then certainly franchising is very well known, very well accepted here in Australia. But probably you have to have a brand that resonates and is known and is accepted over here rather than a company that nobody over here in Australia has talked to. And then, of course, a joint venture partnership, which could be a mixture of some of the things we've talked about above. It could be something where you have a product, you have an potential Australian partner who really believes in the product, thinks it has potential, and is prepared to buy into that partnership with you. So again, those are all options. I don't think that's an exhaustive list, but really those are some of the ways into the market. And I'm sure, as I've said, that is no different to what we've been talking about with the perspective of what you're doing in the UK. Next slide, please. Now, campaign plan. I think that when you're looking at Australia, you do have to look at it more or less as it's a campaign. So some of the things you need to do is, do you understand the cost structure of your product all the way through? How much is it going to cost you? Get the product out of the factory gate. If you have an export product, is it going to cost you more than producing domestically? And the reason that might be the case is that if you do have a order from overseas, a large overseas order, does it mean that you're going to have to perhaps put on an extra shift? Are you going to have to put on somebody who's going to deal with your export sales? Do you have somebody who can translate into a foreign language? Not entirely necessary, I admit, in Australia, although we do speak sometimes a slightly esoteric form of English. But to actually understand how much it's going to cost you, to actually understand what sort of level of sales you intend to achieve. Are you going to try and sell, for example, if you're selling foodstuffs into one of the major supermarkets? Are you looking more at one of the boutique sort of upmarket delicatessens, something in between? Are you just looking perhaps to selling into to service the English expatriate or the British expatriate market over here? And then again, can your current manufacturing support this? What are you actually going to have to do if you suddenly do get a huge order? Well, how are you going to cope with that? You're going to have to cope with an extra shift. You're going to have to put on more people. You're going to have to put on more management. You're going to have to put on an export manager. You're going to have to put on all sorts of people in order to in order to service that demand. And again, if you have an Australian partner, are they comfortable with all of this? Do they understand exactly what your proposition is? I've seen many agency and distribution agreements go onto the rocks simply because there was a misunderstanding there that the Australian partner or the British principal didn't really understand. They hadn't talked to each other in the depth that was necessary, so they hadn't actually got a plan together. They hadn't got a licensing or an agency agreement which allowed them to clearly understand what actually each expected of the other. Make sure that when you're doing all of this stuff, you do understand, and your Australian partner understands exactly what your business plan is. You're both happy and comfortable, and you understand which each other's expectations are of each other. Next slide, please. So you need to ask yourself a couple of key questions. First, I think is, can I import my product into Australia? And some things you can't. For example, bringing meat products into Australia. I talked to a company who manufactured what they reckon were the best meat pies in the UK. Well, bringing meat into Australia is I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's so damn difficult that it might just as well be impossible. So do you know all about the prohibitions and restrictions? Ned is going to come up with a whole raft more of the is, but some of the ones he might not have launched at you. FNANZ, the Food Standard Australia New Zealand, Standards Association of Australia, Therapeutic Goods Australia, tender lists and Australian contact regulations. Those are some of the things that probably you have to know all about before you even begin to start exporting into this country. Next slide, thanks. So looking again at this campaign plan, you have to ask yourself, is your product going to resonate with Australians? Perhaps a story there that I might tell you is a company a while ago that wanted to sell Yorkshire puddings into Australia. Australians haven't got a clue what Yorkshire pudding is. And when the guy was speaking to the buying manager at one of our major supermarkets, this guy was convinced that in fact that he was going to put these Yorkshire puddings in with his dessert section. And so we couldn't quite understand why people were going to buy something that was probably the most uninteresting dessert he'd ever tasted. So again, is it something that Australians are going to understand? I dealt with another company that was talking about selling barbecues over here, and you will probably all have seen these in the service stations, these little sort of disposable barbecues where you light a tray of charcoal and set fire to it and barbecue your steak or whatever. Quite popular in the UK. Most Australians don't use that kind of barbecue at all. They use gas barbecues, and the idea of sort of putting something on charcoal, the way that a lot of Brits do, isn't really what Australians mean when they talk about barbecuing. But this company were convinced that their product was right for Australia. It wasn't. It was dead wrong. So what do you know about the market, and what do you just assume you know? And again, it's a good idea to just check your facts, to try and find out exactly what you do know, to do a bit of market research before just leaping into the market, just thinking that you know stuff. And again, what do you know about the competition, and what do you just think you know? Again, as General Montgomery said, time spent in reconnaissance is never wasted. And I think it's important to make sure that you do a lot of reconnaissance before you get involved into selling into the market. And that means research. It means research you can do or research that somebody else can do. But either way you do it, it's vital. Next slide, thanks. So some of the key elements I think you should have for success are to set yourself reasonable marketing plans, to take a look at the market. And once you've done some research, you'll be able to set your marketing plans and sales targets. And once you're exporting over here, to review them to see how they're going against your plan. I think you need a committed distributor, and that is important, that it really is a case of horses for courses, to find a distributor that's right for your product. And somebody who might be right for your product might be entirely wrong for another product. So it is absolutely necessary to find the right distributor. Committed supplier, that's you, ladies and gentlemen. And I've had a distributor over here referred to the UK as the promised land. They promised to send samples, they promised to send sales literature, they promised to send technical specifications, promised to reply to emails, and never do any of it. Australia is quite American in the way that they like service and they demand instant supplies. If you don't reply to an email within a couple of days, and Australian companies begin to think, well, maybe these people aren't interested. Complete openness, that don't two-time your distributor when you've decided to get into bed with them, then can be completely open about your pricing and margin. As I mentioned, service is paramount over here. We are the Australians think great store by service, almost the same way that the Americans do. So don't think that sort of that a lackadaisical attitude will work with Aussies. It won't. Get involved. Australia is 12,500 miles away from the UK. You'll find at all the major trade shows, there will be Australian buyers over here. They will expect from time to time that maybe you should get yourself on an aeroplane, put your backside on an aeroplane seat and get over here, take a look at the market yourself. And also allow sufficient time. It is necessary to allow a bit of time for the market to mature. Next slide, thanks. Do your homework. And it really is important that I had a guy who came over on a trade mission a while ago, and he'd arrived and the trade mission arrived, the trade delegation arrived in Perth, and his plan, he'd asked his PA whether he could arrange to have a breakfast meeting there in Perth, and then he was going to drive to Adelaide for luncheon and follow up with a dinner that evening in Melbourne. About 3,000 kilometers. I think he's still driving. So do your homework, for goodness sake. Sort of before you actually talk to an Australian distributor, understand. And again, it all comes down to market research, understanding how your product will fit into the market. Next slide, please. So An assessment reappraisal. Do your SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Take a look at what you're selling. Make sure that your unique selling points are right up there, that you understand what your USPs are in the Australian market. Understand what the realistic potential for your brand is. Can you export relevant elements for the UK success? If it works in the UK, chances are that it's going to work over here. And if it doesn't, revise. Take a look at it, see what's going wrong, and get it right. Next slide, thanks. So how can DIT help? DIT is a good organization. I wouldn't have worked for so long with them for so long if I didn't think it was. So some of the things they might be able to do to help you is the OMIS service, which is an industry-specific sector report with a bespoke selection tailored to a specific sector with contacts in core areas. They can help you with a product launch and they can help you with commercial publicity. So don't ignore what help DIT can give. Next slide, thanks. What am I? What am Keyway? Well, we're a consultancy company. We're a group of people who basically I've come across during my 25 years doing this job. I think we can offer client companies up to the business development assistance. We can help you build a market entry and business development proposition, which is going to be both sustainable and profitable. Next slide, thanks. So what we do? Well, what we can do, if you find that for whatever reason our colleagues in DIT can't help you in the depth you want, we can give you an assessment of your product straight away, which is something I'd be happy to do. If you'd like to contact me and say, yeah, you'd like an assessment, I'd be pleased to do that. From that point onwards, I work with you to develop an export proposition and provide a report on market opportunities and help explain to you the processes required to bring your export campaign and some of the hurdles you might have to overcome. That's what we do. That's what we're good at. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so there are my details. I think this slide is this slide deck is being distributed to people. But anyway, you'll be able to find me on that very simple email address. It's just keyway@europe.com. That's all, not .com.au or anything difficult about it. And there'll also, I have got a UK phone number. Obviously, I'm over in Australia at the moment. If for any chance any of that doesn't work, I have a secondary email, which you'll see down the bottom at sidharpuk@hotmail.com. But probably keyway@europe.com is the one you should use. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm happy now to hand over to certainly my colleague and my partner in this endeavor, Mr. Ned Shelton, who will take things forward from this point. Over to you, Ned.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning to everyone. I have had a peek at the countries that people are from, so obviously good morning, the UK, good afternoon, Vietnam, and good evening to people in Australia. Welcome to the show. I am going to say 2 words about who we are, who you are listening to. I am an Australian chartered accountant and have a law background as well. Started Sheltons Accountants Australia some years ago. Started Sheltons Accountants, however, in Europe some 20 years ago. A very welcome, warm welcome, especially to our good colleagues, acquaintances from DIT in Australia. In the UK, I understand that quite a few are listening in. The UK happens to be the most important source of clients for Sheltons Australia, and this means that we are in the UK quite a bit. In fact, I am in continental Europe at the moment and will be in London, in our London office today and tomorrow. So it's a very important part of our lives. Next, please. My presentation will be 15 minutes and is in 2 parts. Firstly, an introduction to the relevant tax and legal implications in the Australian market. And secondly, tax and legal specifics of exporting to Australia. But note, not all of these slides are going to be spoken to. Not all points will be addressed. I understand, as Richard has also said, that these will be available to you one way or another. So hopefully you'll appreciate some of the extra information in the slides that we're not actually speaking about. Thank you. Next. Very briefly, what we do, we are a specialist accounting and business advisory firm. We work exclusively in Sydney with exporters to Australia and inbound investors into Australia. So we're very, very niche. We, on the other hand, provide a very broad range of services to that target group. I will not go into any detail here, so I will just say next, and next, and next. This is for your bedtime reading, and next. Thank you. So to part one, introduction to the relevant tax and legal implications in the Australian market. Generally, Australia offers very significant similarities, very familiar to Brits, but there are some differences and some important differences. At the outset, I'm just going to mention Companies House in the UK. The equivalent approximately in Australia is ASIC. It's one of these acronyms Richard referred to. I won't bother explaining the acronyms at this point. It will come into the future slides in a minute. However, a different feature that doesn't exist in the UK is that every Australian company, if you ever get to that stage, needs an Australian ordinarily resident director. That is not something we know in the UK. Next. The only point I wanted to make here, sorry, if you could go next, is I wanted to mention the GST rate is based on the EU. So those of you who know something about EU VAT and especially UK VAT will be familiar with the system. It is only 10%, however, very few exceptions, food being a common one. We have to make it 10% so we Aussies can figure it out. If it was something more complicated like 17.5, we're all lost. Another very different feature is that every Australian business, now whether that's a company or some other kind of presence in Australia, needs a public officer. This is a requirement under the Tax Act, and that person is ultimately potentially liable for the taxes of that taxpayer, whether the taxpayer be an Australian subsidiary company or a UK-based business itself. Company tax rates, very briefly, fairly expensive in Australia still. 27.5% is the lowest you can get in Australia. That compares to the 19% in the UK. Next. The tax year in Australia, everything is upside down. Quite understandably, therefore, our tax year starts on the 1st of July. We have Christmas coinciding with our long summer holiday, so nothing happens in December or January. Note those who come down in the first week of January expecting a lot of meetings, it's just not going to happen. Next, please. We have something called fringe benefits tax, which is very important if you have an employee in Australia at all and you pay, for example, health insurance. That will give the employer a tax burden. It's not a problem for the employee. In every other country I'm aware of, it's the employee that has the extra tax, but not our system in Australia, it's the employer. It means basically that there is little or no fringe benefits actually paid. It's simply gross salary and certain allowances. We do have some state taxes, not like the US where there is an actual tax on income at the state level. We don't have an income tax at the state level, but we have various other indirect taxes such as car rego, which we like to say, car registration tax, stamp duty tax, real estate tax, and something called payroll tax, which is not the same as PAYE. Next. You can go next, thanks. And next. A very important consideration is whether your presence in Australia, for example, do you have a warehouse, do you have an employee, do you have an agent, do you have a fulfillment house? Does that connection with Australia cause you to need to be registered with ASIC, which is very commonly the case? And does it, of more importance though, cause you to have to pay company tax, which you will if you have a so-called permanent establishment in Australia. We will be talking about these briefly later on. Just very briefly, next please. If the UK company, I'm looking at the third bullet point there, if the UK company has a PE, a permanent establishment in Australia, then you're taxed in Australia on the business profits attributable to that. And it is a very important aspect, and if you get into this without knowing it, you will pay a fairly pretty penalty. It's something you need to understand before you get to the stage of having the presence that causes you to have a permanent establishment. Next, please. In terms of needing to register with ASIC, which is a company law matter, not a tax matter, even a minor physical presence in Australia will lead to the need to register a branch. So the fulfillment house, the employee, etc., if you have anything that is close to that, you need to take advice to see if you need to register with ASIC. If you don't, you can run into penalties, not so much pecuniary penalties, but other prohibitions from doing business, etc., that can cause unhappiness, to put it mildly. Next, please. Next. So part two, we're going to run through from the very basic presence in Australia, the very elementary introduction from export, and we're going to follow through a greater and greater presence in Australia and say two words about having a company in Australia. So we're starting with pure export. The customs duty and GST, which is our VAT, are for the importer, as that's the general principle. However, the liability there that was on the importer has been extended, and we'll look at this in a little while. If you're Googling and you've come across or you've read something about anything under $1,000 being free of GST, that has been abolished. There is a $1,000 limit still, which is only relevant to the formalities that need to be complied with. It has nothing to do with the obligation to pay GST or not. Until now, or until this change, all imports by consumers, by private persons, of up to $1,000 per consignment were free of GST and customs duties, not anymore. Some things are free. Richard mentioned food, some clothing, wheelchairs, etc. Both the customs duty and the GST on import is paid to the ATO, the Australian Tax Office, the equivalent of HMRC. On customs duty, there is no deferral. You pay at the border, end of discussion. Unlike the UK, imports into the UK, you can defer the customs duty. GST is payable at customs clearance, so on entry to the country, but you can arrange for a deferral scheme and pay later. Next, please. For many exporters to Australia, what they really need is an online and Australian domain name to facilitate sales to Australians. You can't, as a foreign entity, simply acquire a .com.au domain name. This is the main commercial domain name. You need to either have an Australian entity, for example, an Australian subsidiary company, or a so-called ABN, or you need to have a trademark, or at least to have applied to register a trademark in Australia. And again, the trademark or the Australian entity's name needs to be quite close to the domain name you want to register. Having a domain name in Australia and selling via that does not necessarily cause the profits to be taxed in Australia. Not necessary. But if it's combined with other things, such as an employee or perhaps a fulfillment house or a warehouse, you may well be close to having a taxable permanent establishment. Next, please. So in order to obtain a domain name, as I said, you need to apply for a trademark, but a trademark registration is something that really ought to be considered in any event. A lot of UK businesses launch into Australia and don't protect themselves. It is very important to consider the protection of your intellectual property. We are honest and good, ethically, people of a high ethical level, of course, in Australia, but let's face it, in a country of 25 million, there are a few dodgy types who will take you for a ride and will snap up opportunities to abuse the situation. You need to protect yourself. The ABN, the Australian business number, an alternative if you want to get a domain name. This is a bit of a process, requires documents certified by the Australian High Commission. So we're imagining a UK company itself is the one wanting to obtain an ABN. The ABN is one way you can then qualify to get an Australian domain name, but often you need an ABN for other purposes. For example, if you need to register for GST, or if you need to employ someone, in practice at least, you'll need an ABN. So this dreaded ABN comes up in many ways. Next, please. Next, please. And next. So the GST is due by the importer based on a certain value, which is often an issue as well. The customs value of the goods is the basis for the GST, and the customs duty may well also be applicable on a somewhat similar basis. Next, please. The payment, as I said, is on GST and duty is payable at the border, although we can defer the GST. Thank you. Next. There are some important changes on digital imports, as we call it, as of a year ago. This applies to supplies to consumers. Now, in our terms, GST terminology, a consumer is simply a non-registered party. For example, a private consumer sitting in Broken Hill or in Bondi Beach. It is the opposite, is a business which is registered for GST. So digital goods and services, and we'll see what digital goods is in a minute, digital goods and services are subject to GST. Overseas suppliers exceeding 75,000 Australian dollars, roughly speaking, you can halve it to get pounds, right? So it's about 40,000 pounds. If you're selling VATable or GSTable supplies more than 75,000 Australian dollars, then you need to register in Australia. You need to collect the GST. Also on low value goods, that is the ones that the consignment is less than $1,000. Digital goods, which is an odd term, but this is software, gaming, media streaming. They're called goods, but digital goods, even though it is not a physical good. We call them digital goods. We call it the Netflix tax. That has been subject to GST since July. And digital services are subject to GST as well. So architectural, engineering services. So someone sitting in Broken Hill gets some consulting advice from a UK company. So long as that UK company is exceeding the $75,000, then that is also subject now to Australian GST. Next, please. We're talking about increasing your presence, and now we are going on to what will happen if you rent a warehouse or rent space in a warehouse. You have a stock of goods, very common from the UK, in order to be able to deliver rapidly. Alone, if all you have in Australia, your only presence is a stock of goods in a warehouse, then you won't have a taxable permanent establishment. However, if your business that is dealing with Australia is not the UK, but from some other country, take care, The reason for this is that the only reason having a warehouse in Australia does not give rise to a taxable permanent establishment is the tax treaty, the double tax agreement between Australia and the UK. And not all double tax agreements have this protection. So from some other countries going into the UK, having a warehouse will indeed, or warehouse space, give rise to a taxable presence. Having sales staff may well give rise to you having a permanent establishment, even if it's an unrelated person. For example, if it's just one person who is acting as your agent, and that's mainly all they do, that's their main income, then that person will, or that arrangement will end up constituting a permanent establishment in Australia. Next, please. There are a couple more examples of what will give rise and will not give rise to permanent establishments there. Thank you. Next, please. What is best to have a permanent establishment or no permanent establishment or a subsidiary is a matter which is often easy to come to grips with, but sometimes it's very complex. Next, please. Having an Australian subsidiary is something that we find is often coming into play even earlier than expected because of a variety of reasons which perhaps initially are not expected. One being that your supplier requires that they deal with an Australian entity. There are certain reasons for that, why they'll want to do that, their own commercial considerations. Another is that you wish to convey a serious presence in Australia, to be able to show to your suppliers or potential customers, I should say, in Australia, that you're serious about Australia. Setting up a subsidiary is often necessary for that purpose. Next, please. So this issue of having a permanent establishment, not having a permanent establishment, or having a subsidiary, what is best, is something that you have there are a few notes there about. Thank you. Next, please. So Selena Hander, who is listening in, is in charge of our Sydney office on a daily basis. I am spending most of my life in relation to our Sydney office, although I'm spending a lot of time in Europe. Right now, I'm in Europe, as I said in the beginning. Feel free to contact either of us, ideally by email. You can also try and call. That is obviously the Australian office number. Look forward to hearing from some of you at least, and thank you very much. And those of you in this part of the world, enjoy the rest of the summer. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ned, and Richard as well. So obviously lots of information there about how to sell into Australia, lots of practical stuff too, which is always good to know about. So we're now going to open the floor for questions. So please do ask questions using the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. The first one I'm going to put to Richard, and it's just around, we've always got a bit of a food and drink presence on these calls. So we've had a couple of questions around the demand for imported foods into Australia, and I think would you be able to just give a little bit more of an introduction to what food and drink companies will need to know if they're looking to export into Australia?
Yes, okay, thank you very much for that. Look, I think the important thing to say is that Australians are quite receptive of all manner of imported goods, not just from the UK, but from really all around the world. And in fact, a lot of Australian a lot of Australian food is now imported, but I don't really think a lot of that falls into the categories that the companies here would be interested in. It would be product from Southeast Asia, and that might be seafood, it might be all sorts of stuff that is actually manufactured in our near markets or our near import-export partners in Southeast Asia. What we tend to find in the context of British and European goods is that it tends to be probably more upmarket goods. And I'd be talking here about a number of things that you might be a little bit surprised to find over here on the Australian supermarket shelves. And that could be Twinings tea, it could be Walker's shortbread, it could be McVitie's biscuits, it could be half a dozen types of tea that are available in Australia, which quite well known in the UK. Tailors of Harrogate would be one, Twinings would be another. There are about half a dozen others. Coffees, curry sauces, spices, that sort of thing. So really the common line that runs through all of this is that they're a little bit different. They have a unique selling point, that sometimes they carry a cachet because they're made in the UK. And even though there is a Buy Australian campaign, and that a lot of Australians do deliberately try to buy product with Australian content, that I think that really what we're talking about here is slightly different to that. And it is products that, again, are a little bit upmarket, a little bit different, and people, rightly or wrongly, think that it carries possibly a little bit of snob value. That I think that a lot of companies think, well, there are a lot of expatriate Brits living in Australia, and perhaps we can make a killing selling to them. My personal view is that that can be a mistake. That sure, there are a couple of distributors who do make a living out of supplying iconic British products. I think the word there is iconic. The ones that probably the UK companies, UK expatriates were used to back home, and they could be sort of Fry's, Bassett's, Ambrosia, PG Tips, Walker's crisps, that sort of thing. But mostly, I think that really to achieve the sort of value you want, you have to sell mainstream and to have to sell Australian and to Australians to achieve value. And if you want to ask how it's done, then I would ask Jim Walker from Walker's Shortbread in Avalor in Scotland, who is a master at selling and has really carved out, not just in this country, but around the world, an export niche. If you want to find out how it's done well, then talk to Jim Walker of Walker's Shortbread. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. And a question we had in advance from Paula is probably for you, Ned, and it's around kind of the option of licensing some of the manufacturing to an Australian company to save on shipping costs. Kind of how do you advise kind of Paula in this situation? Ned.
Excuse me, is this a question I can see, or is it just something that's come up?
It's one we sent in advance from Paula.
Oh,
So
good one. I mean, the question for everyone's interest there from Paula is the word costs. That's the question that I can see. But if you could just say again, Will, I'm sorry, what you understood the question to be?
She was looking to license some manufacturing to an Australian company to save on shipping costs.
Okay, I'm sorry. I've just misread it. My humble apologies. I mean, I had volunteered to answer this question on a misunderstanding. So really, this should be for Richard. I'm sorry. My apologies. Richard,
All right.
OTY.
All right. Okay, I see that cricket ball coming in my direction. All right, I did actually mention manufacturer under license in my presentation, and again, it is a good way to negate some of the costs. And I can think of, particularly in the food and drink sector, and a number of companies who've done this, and a lot of those are now iconic companies, as you'd expect. You know, sort of Patex would probably be a good example of a company that, to begin with, started exporting stuff over here from the UK, and then decided that it was far easier, that the volume had been built up and the market had been built up enough to start manufacturing locally. So I think that probably to license or to manufacture under license is something that a lot of Australian companies are aware of, that they are amenable to it. If they think the proposition is good, if they think the product has legs over here. I think in many cases what it would be to convince a potential Australian partner that the product is something that will resonate with an Australian consumer. And so I think that probably it will have to prove itself in the marketplace before you're going to find an MUL partner who's going to be falling over themselves to do it. But it is certainly a viable route to the market, and certainly something where I think that an MUL partner will quite easily and quite readily be found if you have a product that works for that kind of MUL paradigm. It is most certainly something that I'm I'm very well aware of, that I've dealt with a lot of companies who've done it. And it could be just as simple as, for example, I'm not going to mention any names, but a fairly well-known British cider company who decided that what they were going to do was just bring the product over here in bulk rather than bring bottles, which sort of heavy and cost a lot to freight over here. Bring the cider over here in bulk and then have it bottled here in Australia and distributed by their Australian manufacturer under license partner. In fact, though, it was actually branded as the same type of cider as you find in the UK. So it was the UK manufacturer's name on it, but it was in fact an MUL partnership agreement. So it is something that can certainly work, but I think that the product has to prove itself in the marketplace before you actually attempt it.
Thank you. We got there in the end at least. So yeah, thank you, Richard. And a question which I think Ned you might be interested in is from Robin, and it's kind of how is the import of digital goods and services into Australia being policed, and who are the kind of regulating bodies for this?
Yes, no, very good question. The regulating body is simply the Australian Tax Office, of which the Customs and Immigration is, let's say, a sidekick too. But generally we say the Australian Taxation Office. On import of physical goods, things through the border, Customs are the ones who collect it. But it's the Australian Tax Office that has the issue of administering this. I would say Australia has the most sophisticated digital surveillance systems in any other country I know, and the most advanced legislation in terms of being able to exchange information between different government agencies, between different government departments, which means that the Australian authorities or the Australian Tax Office has access to a lot of information. How this is going to be policed is obviously a massive issue. It was a very important consideration in the deliberations up to the decision, and the difficulty in policing and the cost of collecting was one of the reasons Australia had this $1,000 minimum. It was considered at that point that anything under $1,000, i.e. maximum 10% GST is 100, it's just not worth the trouble of trying to police and try to collect. It was only due to the incredible pressure in recent years from the retailers who felt it was unfair, or other suppliers in Australia, that people could import also digital services without GST compared to doing it in Australia with GST. So that's as far as I can answer the question. The answer to your question in terms of how it will be policed is an ongoing matter. The answer is not yet quite clear.
Thank you, Ned. And we've had a couple of questions in around Amazon and the kind of how tax obligations in Australia could be affected by Amazon. Richard, I think we had one in advance about this as well. This is from Nicholas. So kind of what effect do you think Amazon starting rule will have?
Okay, that's a good question, and it's one that obviously is raising a lot of noise here in Australia, because I think that really it is an unknown quantity in as far as the actual effect it will have. That I've read a number of reports about this which range from not very much at all to a great deal, and I think probably in the short term it will be not quite as sort of dramatic as people think, because the information I'm reading is that people will start to use Amazon, they will start to become familiar with it, but there will be a sort of a lead up and a ramp up to that. And it's not something that is going to happen overnight, that there will be a gradual sort of transition to e-commerce. Remember that Australians are quite familiar with e-commerce and quite familiar with the sort of with dealing with companies such as Amazon already. And so to some extent, Australian retailers are aware of the challenge, but I think that as time goes on and Amazon becomes more of a force in the market, it will certainly sort of challenge some of, for example, the department supermarkets we have over here, the like of Target and Kmart probably, that I think that there will sort of be an increasing sort of challenge from Amazon for companies and for who provide those sorts of products. As far as mainstream is concerned, well, I think that a lot of people still enjoy shopping for whatever reason, sort of the retail experience and going out into the mall and actually doing shopping and taking a look at stuff and actually being able to examine stuff before they buy it. So I think in the short term, probably more noise than actual substance, but that will change. And who knows in a few years' time, what presence Amazon will have in the marketplace. But my own view is that I think it will become increasingly significant.
Thank you, Richard. We're starting to run a little bit low on time, so I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and the first one of those would be one from Sam, and is it possible to research a company in Australia like we can in the UK on Companies House? I'll put that to Ned.
Yeah, hi Sam. It's quite simple. ASIC, ASIC, is the approximate equivalent. If you Google ASIC, you will find it's not too difficult to find the place to put in the name of the company you're searching. However, you have to pay. You get very, very little information unless you pay. A minimum is $9, whereas with Companies House, you get a lot of information for free. Secondly, a lot of Australian companies are considered small. The definition of small is in the slides I presented, and you will hopefully get. If you are small, you don't need to be audited and you don't need to file any financial statements at all. And the small includes turnover of under 25 million Australian dollars and some other tests. So you can be quite a decent sized company and still be small. In other words, you might not find the financial statements at ASIC at all.
Thank you. And
thank
you. Last question I will ask is from Caroline, and it's just a quick question about what the economy is like in Australia at the moment, and what sorts of investment is going into Australia in general. I'll put that through to Ned first, then Richard.
In the interest of time, I will say good and a lot. So the economy is doing well, and Australian employers invest a lot, if you ask me as an employer, and observing. The market is very strong. OTY, Richard.
Yes, I think I'd agree with that, Ned. Obviously, you talk to various people in various industries and they all have their own view about it. And I think that some of the litmus is maybe talking to the taxi drivers, or used to be, but now you can get nothing but a string of complaints about Uber from them. So that's one of my favorite ways of trying to gauge how the economy was going, which now doesn't seem to work quite so well. But most of the people I talk to are optimistic that I believe that the Australian economy has yet to go into recession for. And Ned will probably know how many years it is now since we've gone into recession. But it is performing, and I think that generally things are optimistic. Probably more optimistic over here in the eastern states than over in the west, where the mining boom has finished. But I think generally things are good.
Yes, it has surprised people that despite the mining boom cooling down dramatically some years ago, Australia is still doing so well. It is currently only one of 10 or 11 countries on the planet out of 200 countries that is AAA credit rated by the 3 major credit rating agencies. So on paper, it looks really good, and I think it is strong.
Great. Well, on that note, a positive note to finish up on. So thank you both to Ned and to Richard.
Will, could I just chip in very quickly and say that if anybody does have additional questions, they've got my email address. If they want to shoot me an email, if they haven't had a chance to have the questions answered, and they think I might be able to help, I'd be delighted to try and reply privately.
Thank you. And yes, we will be circulating contact details again for Richard and Ned in the follow-up messaging to this. So yeah, thank you once again, Ned and Richard, and I hope everyone has found that useful.
Thank you, William, and thank you all.
So continuing the Beyond the EU theme, the Institute of Export and International Trade will be running a day-long workshop in London with Corporate Catalyst India, guiding businesses through the challenges of selling there. And if you're looking to gain the skills and knowledge to help your business do exporting properly and successfully, do have a look at our suite of qualifications. Our qualifications are designed to give individuals and businesses the skills needed to export successfully and compliantly. Find out details about qualifications can help your business go global on export.org.uk qualifications. There's now just 1 month remaining for companies from all over the world to enter the Open to Export International Business Awards. What could be construed as the SME World Cup is a project we are running with the support of the World Trade Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce as part of their Small Business Champions Initiative. This is a great chance for companies from all over the world to win $5,000 towards their export action plans, and the final will be taking place in Geneva in October as part of WTO's public forum. This will be a great chance to meet business leaders, government officials, journalists, international officials, and many more from the glitterati of world trade. So definitely do have a look at this wonderful opportunity. More information can be found at opentoexport.com/international-business-awards. Our next webinar will give you tips on how to get the most of agents and distributors when working with them to drive sales in international markets. John Reed from Export Aid and the Institute of Exports will be joined by Liz Ward from Virtuous Legal for that session on August 16th. You can find sign-up details for all our future webinars at opentoexport.com/webinars. As always, please do take our exit survey to let us know what you thought of today's webinar and to give us any suggestions for improvements or future topics. For now, many thanks for dialing in and apologies for slightly running over. But let's hope that by the next time we're running a webinar, it truly has come home. But for now, goodbye.